Hello, everyone.
Whoa, hello, everyone.
Hello,
guys.
Hello from Sweden.
Yes.
I feel like I'm in the jury of the Eurovision.
Who's
the votes from the Swedish jury. sorry, Kelly. Sorry, back to you.
Yes, no, it's all right. Ule, if you want to start sharing your screen as well.
Sure.
Share some slides. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I'm Kelly. I'm a relations developer advocate for KubeShop. We have lovely Brad here, who is our host from Brisbane, right?
Yeah, close enough.
Close-ish, kind of.
Yeah.
Southern Hemisphere.
Southern Hemisphere, yeah.
Ule, who is our CTO from Stockholm. Say hi, Ule.
Hi, Ule. Hi, everyone. I'm the CTO in Stockholm for KubeShop. Thrilled to be here to talk to Brad and anyone else who is willing to talk and listen about TestKube.
Awesome. And then we have Bruno from Lisbon, Portugal, who is the product manager for TestKube, which we'll be talking about today.
Exactly.
Yes.
Hi, guys. Happy to be here.
Awesome.
Okay.
Yeah, let's get started. Might as well. So we're going to be kind of running through what TestKube is, what kind of problems it solves, what we kind of have in the pipeline, and all of that good jazz to kind of get people up to date on it. So, Ule, awesome. Take it away.
Okay, awesome. So just a question. So I can't see the cameras anymore. Oh, whoa, look at that. That is so awesome. Okay, well, I'll just do it like this. Okay, great. So thank you so much for that. And lovely to be here in this late evening from Stockholm, Sweden. It's dark and cold, but not in here. So TestKube is a project that we've embarked on at KubeShop since about 6 months. I think it's been open sourced on GitHub. And I have a long background working at a company called SmartBear, which does testing tools, where I've worked a lot with open source and testing. And when I started working with Kubernetes, not too long ago, I'll have to admit, like a year ago, I felt, I've felt that there are some things in when it comes to moving the traditional kind of integration testing that I was used to from the tools that SmartBear did into the Kubernetes world. There were still some challenges there, and just how everyone is adopting CI/CD and now GitOps and all those things. So that's kind of a little bit of a backstory. And as I was involved in projects where there was with Kubernetes and people trying to do tests and create integration tests specifically, or maybe performance tests, etc. A couple of problems quickly came into focus, and we thought, why don't we try to solve those problems, or at least tackle them and see if we can build a framework that makes testing, and specifically integration testing and more complex testing, easier with Kubernetes. And obviously we're not targeting like unit tests here. We're targeting more integration tests where you might want to run tests against your UI, your APIs. You might be testing different protocols. You might have a microservice architecture, with a lot of services and versions and all that kind of stuff. And so where testing is a pretty complex thing, right? And it's not something, it's something that's really central to your delivery, and you want to get it right, which is hard, as all of us know. So a couple of things that we kind of try to boil down, what do we think is challenging with testing today? And one thing, the first two bullets here is how testing and test execution is often very coupled to CI/CD and build deployment. And what I mean by that is, if often when you build something, you run your tests at the same time, right? And that kind of makes sense. But as a tester, you often want to be able to run tests, more not in sync with your builds, right? You might want to run some ad hoc tests. Maybe some components have been updated. You just need to rerun certain parts of your test suite. You don't want to rerun everything just to kind of validate some minor fix. Let's say you've upgraded a component in your cluster, right? You've upgraded a version of, I don't know what, Nginx or whatever, and you just want to rerun certain tests. You don't want to have to run a build for that. Just as a tester, you want to be able to go in and execute specific tests. And that was often a challenge, because the orchestration of tests was often very tied to CI/CD, like GitHub Actions or Jenkins or whatever, and the last thing that you did in your deployment pipeline. So if a tester says, hey, can we rerun these 3 tests, please? It's like, well, we'd have to rerun the build, and that'll take 30 minutes or whatever. So it felt like there was a much too tight coupling there between test orchestration and execution and build orchestration and deployment. And the coupling makes sense. I get it. And so I'm not saying you shouldn't be able to run tests for your builds, but I'm saying that it might be helpful to kind of try to put some separation in there to give both testers and developers, of course, or engineers more freedom when it comes to testing activities. Another since I can't see you anymore, I can't see kind of your reactions to this. So you're just going to have to jump in and ask me questions and interrupt. Another thing that was pretty obvious is that when you deploy things in Kubernetes, there are some restrictions imposed, specifically around network access, but there could be other things as well around security, and that was not always easy to get around. I mean, some organizations might have generous DevOps people who will just open up the ports and give you access as you need, but that's definitely not always the case. But on the flip side of that, I think also Kubernetes, just with how its architecture and around scalability and everything, also kind of provides a lot of functionality that can actually help with testing, especially around scaling tests and managing tests as state of your cluster. And I'm going to get back to that. So I think there's actually a lot to gain if you're using Kubernetes in the right way for test execution and orchestration. So that's kind of also something we wanted to tap into. And then the final point, which is maybe a more generic point, doesn't really relate to Kubernetes, is that especially if you're a microservices team and you're a polyglot kind of thing, so everyone is allowed to use whatever language or framework they want, which isn't nice in a way, but one thing you'll end up with is you'll also have a lot of different testing frameworks or testing tools, testing libraries that generate results in very different formats. And this was something that a QA manager, which people who kind of have the responsibility to track metrics around QA and or to what's our test pass failure rate. Sounds boring, but it's super important in organizations to track that consistently across a large number of different types of components and services. So it's also something we felt like, this should be rolled into this problem. And I know there are other ways to solve that, but it felt like a natural thing to address here with TestKube as well. Yes.
I was going to ask Brad if he had any kind of experience working with testing with Kubernetes, or do you kind of on your team or your past teams, I don't know, just not integrated?
Yeah,
or
I think it's interesting what he said about the polyglot businesses now, or organizations, because there's so many different languages, so many different frameworks, and I've seen a lot of companies build a framework that only works for one language and they've got to go do it again, and then someone leaves, and it's a bit of a mess actually. It's the QA teams are really like chasing themselves at the moment. So
yeah,
to unify on that, I think is quite a good problem to actually solve. Because
and it's definitely
they're getting quite big, the teams. Like I'm seeing in smaller companies, like there's even more QA team than my cloud team. So
wow,
it's starting to be a big a big deal for organizations, because it can affect your branding and it can kill a company if you're not doing your testing properly.
Definitely.
So yeah, it's very interesting.
The people, Brad, kind of talking about that, are the people that are on these QA teams, are they pretty technical people, like engineers that have moved over to QA, or are they separate?
It's a bit of a range, really. Yeah, I mean, some of them are, some of them aren't. I think also as a tester, it's hard you can't be an expert in everything, and testing touches so much things. So sometimes they're not technical across everything, but yeah, it's having a tool to be able to help them with that would be a huge advantage.
Yeah, and I think especially if you just the asynchronicity of organizations where you have, you might have a bunch of microservices. They're managed by separate teams. They all have their own build pipelines. and they're always, they're spread out all over the world, and there's just a lot of things and tests being run and things going on, and just trying to, as if you're like a product owner, Bruno, but if you're like a product owner and you want to get like a consistent view of, what are our quality metrics? How are, if we track, we have all these tests in our system, how can we find out if certain areas of our system are starting to fail more, or if tests are starting to take longer time, right? It's also just non-functional aspects of testing are super important. We made this upgrade to some component in our cluster, and suddenly tests are slower, and how do we detect that in a consistent way across multiple components? Because if you just if just one diligent person notices it for one of the components, that might just be written off as an anomaly. But if you can somehow aggregate data from multiple ongoing test activities and try to do some intelligent analytics on that can be really helpful. And to your point, I know this kind of testing it scares a lot of people away, but to your point, it's business critical, right? If your stuff doesn't work and your customers aren't happy, they'll go somewhere else. And so it's super important. And that, I think that whole area around analytics and test results is super interesting in itself. It's something that is maybe not the center focus of TestKube yet, but it could definitely be.
Yeah, I think I like what you say about the metrics as well, because how do you know if you're successful if you can't benchmark the metrics? A lot of like DevOps calculators these days, where maybe a consultant comes in, they'll say, okay, this is what we have today, this is where we want to be. But if you don't have those metrics, then how can you prove that you're being successful? And how many, I've been in a lot of software engineering companies that are relatively big, and when there's a release coming out, people will start pushing code, and that will have to run through the pipelines and testing. And that slows down a lot. There's a big queue. So I think metrics around how long the tests are taking are really good as well.
Yeah, and thinking about how to, I don't want to start talking about machine learning and AI, but the thing that you could hopefully deduct from metrics without manually having to sift through them, I think is also super interesting, just to kind of detect patterns or discrepancies in comparing to results and test execution output that you've run previously, and trying to detect when something seems to be going in the wrong direction. If you're a tester, you can always, you have that sense of smell. As I remember, you can smell when things are going in the wrong direction. So other people will say, it's just a fluke, but testers can usually kind of, this doesn't feel like a fluke to me. This is actually something that we should be investigating more, or this could be something real. So super exciting, but it's a little bit of a tangent to TestKube at this point.
So now at the moment you have Cypress, Postman, curl.
Yeah,
those are like I'll let you. It's probably done.
Yeah, sorry, I'll got stuck on the first slide. So some of the ideas we wanted, so I guess address with TestKube then, is we want it to be agnostic to any CI/CD tool, in the sense that we want testers and engineers to be able to orchestrate and execute tests without being dependent on that functionality in CI/CD, right? So, and because if you today are going to run a Postman collection or a Cypress test or a Selenium test from whatever, from GitHub Actions or Jenkins or Circle CI or whatever else, it's going to be a little bit different. There's going to be different plugins to use, and orchestrating those and making sure that they run in a way is going to be different for each one. And we'd like to say, hey, why don't we do all the orchestration execution in one place, and then just have, whatever CI/CD tool you can use as many as you want. You can just trigger the execution of those tests running in TestKube. So it's kind of an abstraction layer to that. And we want to be GitOps compatible. And I think this is a super interesting aspect of testing, where we think that one way to do this is to actually include tests in the state of your cluster. Similar to your car has its self-test, right, when you start it, hopefully, and it'll go through a bunch of tests and see that it's working. You should have your cluster, and your applications should always be able to test themselves, right? They shouldn't be depending on some externally available artifacts or tools being online. Wouldn't it be awesome if you could at any point go into your cluster, and say, hey, run these functional tests or these load tests or whatever, and you know that it's all contained, it's part of the state of my cluster. And I'm sure this is not for everyone, but I think it's an interesting academic exercise, at least, and definitely helpful, because often, when things stop working, you're like, oh, let's rerun these tests, but oh, they're not in the right place, or we were just updating them, oh, we haven't configured them correctly. But if you know that they're part of the state of your cluster, you kind of feel safe that you can always rerun your tests. You can even use them as a kind of a monitor. I know you have health checks in Kubernetes, but that's kind of a very basic kind of way of seeing if your services or pods are live. This is more about checking that things actually work the way they're supposed to do. And then ultimately, TestKube itself is a framework for running other types of tests. So you already pointed out Postman, Cypress, but it's not constrained from a technical point of view to any testing framework. We just have to provide executors for whatever. So it doesn't have to be functional tests only. It could be load tests. It could be security tests. It could be compliance tests. It could be unit tests. If you want to run those inside your cluster, technically that's definitely doable. I'm not sure it's the right thing to do, but hey, I think we've been in this for so long, we know that there's always going to be that outlier need with some team, etc. And if we can make that possible, at least, then why not? And then I think we talked about results. I think also today, if you look at running tests as jobs in Kubernetes, as a tester at least, it can be pretty cumbersome to have to package up your Postman collections in a Docker image with Newman, or if using Cypress, or once again everything else. And we'd like to kind of make all of that much easier. Why don't we just let users point to their Postman collections, and we can do all the wrapping automatically for them, make sure it's the latest version of Newman, make sure it's compatible with whatever else you're running, and you don't have to have that effort for integrating the testing frameworks that you're using and being able to run those tests in your cluster. So that's kind of some of the ideas here. So Brad, does that resonate with you?
Yeah, no, it sounds good. I have some GitOps questions, but I think it will be too technical for this talk. But
okay, well,
yeah,
there's some more technical stuff coming later, so I'll just
we can talk about it then, maybe.
Yeah. So who should use it? Well, I think we've touched on that. We think teams who are already using or transitioning to Kubernetes, teams who are doing integration testing, right? This is not, as I mentioned, maybe primarily for unit testing, which you do as part of your build, as if you compile or post-compile step in your builds. If you use a lot of CI/CD for testing and feel that kind of sometimes gets in the way of how you'd like to run tests, orchestrate tests. If you want a consistent approach to test results, and then if you're struggling with Kubernetes and testing. So that's kind of where we think TestKube could hopefully help. And if we look at the current state, TestKube is very much a vision, and we've come a certain way, right? Getting there, and so we have a CLI, right? You can install it. It's a plugin to kubectl. You can use it to install TestKube in your cluster, which will set up everything you need. We have executors for Postman Collections, Cypress tests, and curl commands, and there's an example executor. How to create your own, write them in Go. It's not super hard. I think the hard part might be to output the results from that executor in the format that TestKube expects. So you might have to transform the results in a meaningful way. We do support, like Cypress, you can get the videos produced by Cypress, right? So you can see them afterwards if your test failed or not. So there's definitely some support for test artifacts and that kind of stuff. We have some basic test orchestration and parameterization, meaning that you can run scripts on their own, or you can run them together in sequence, basically. And parameterization is that you can pass in parameters, right? So you're not hard coding the URLs that you're running your tests against, or the username passwords, or whatever you might be using your test to validate functionality. And parameterization is a super important step to also to create more modular tests, but also to take you to data-driven testing, which is super big in many organizations, something that we definitely have on the roadmap, but it's not something we do currently. And as I said, tests and scripts can be stored in your cluster, and which kind of caters to this GitOps thing. And we do have a dashboard, which I'll show you, of course, for viewing tests and results. It's a read-only, meaning that you can't use it to manipulate, you can't use it to create tests or run tests or delete tests. all that you'd have to do through the CLI for now. It's just that we haven't got around to building, all of that functionality. Definitely something we want to have there as well.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to take a breather there. So, Brad, does this lead to any of your questions?
Yeah. So when we say that the tests and script definitions are stored in the cluster, is that done through the CLI, or does that link to the Get repo?
So that's done through the CLI. So through the CLI commands that you, but you could then integrate that with, Argo CD or something if you wanted to do like a GitOps kind of workflow. But you don't have to store them in your cluster. So for example, for which I'll show you, Cypress, you can you store your tests in a Git repository, and we'll have that for Postman as well, right? So the script definition that you put in your cluster only just points to your Git repo, and then whenever the test is executed, TestKube will kind of clone and extract, the current state of the repo. You can point it at a branch, obviously, and so you have the right right instance of the tests that you want to run. So that that might work nice with the workflow that you have, where you have testers just pushing things into their repo, and then you can just point to that repo and run those tests whenever you want to.
Yeah, maybe to add to that, basically the tests and scripts are CRDs, Kubernetes CRDs that TestKube defines. So the same way you define your you define your application, like your deployment files, everything else, you also could define the tests in your repo. And then when you deploy the application, you also deploy those tests.
Yeah, okay. That's cool. Yeah, I wasn't sure if it's a CRD or not, but that's really handy. No, I was just going along like the true GitOps, but yeah, that sounds like it's actually following that, which is good.
Yes, so thanks, Bruno, for clarifying that. Yes, so tests and scripts, I'll show you the CRTs in a sec.
Yeah.
Really building up to the demo.
No,
but
that sounds really good, actually. That's really cool, and we're seeing a lot of GitOps adoption, and maybe in the next year or two, probably see like everyone using the GitOps, which would be really cool.
Yeah, and you could definitely see a model here where you're using the tool, whatever tool you're using to create tests, you push them into your repo, then you have something like Argo CD, which then picks up those scripts and then uses a plugin for Argo. I think they call them, what do they call it? I don't remember, plugins, and to package those scripts in the CRDs and push them into your cluster, right? So your cluster is always up to date with whatever scripts you might have coming from the tool that you're using. And then once again, as we talked before, you can trigger the execution of those tests from CI/CD, of course, if you want, but also manually from the command line or through whatever tool you prefer, right? It's an API call, basically, to run your tests.
Yeah.
Okay. Any more questions on this?
No, that answered my question, thanks.
Okay, cool. So just to jump ahead a little bit, there's a CLI, there's a dashboard, and there's a nifty little diagram. Jumping. This is the ugly slide, but to kind of show the workflow, right? So you would start out by creating your tests using whatever testing tool you have, which would result in some kind of scripts, and then you would import your tests into your cluster, and you can do that manually with the CLI, or automated that, as we talked about, Argo or whatever. And then the TestKube server would be tasked with executing those scripts. So you basically tell the server, say, hey, run these tests and read these scripts. And then the server will instantiate, basically technically it'll create a job using an executor, pointing that executor to the script to be run. And then it'll collect the results and make those available to the dashboard. And that's all happening inside your cluster. So I think it's pretty straightforward, I guess. Any comments or thoughts about that?
Oh, I think you're muted, Brad.
Can you go back to the last slide with, this one, and just a diagram on the right? So that TestKube acts sort of like a control plane, and that manages all the executors. And how do they talk to each other?
You mean technically? I didn't have the right person on the call. So TestKube launches the jobs. I'm guessing it's a gRPC that or that API between the executor and the API server or the controller, so that the executor reports the results back to TestKube, which then writes it to a store and also saves the artifacts to a Minio storage mechanism, which you could tie to S3 or something else, I guess.
Yeah, I was going to say, with the control plane, it would be cool if you could use cloud events as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can integrate with tools like Captain, where you can have, leverage their quality gates, and then you can have your executors run as testing, and then the quality gate to release to production for continuous deployment would be really cool.
Exactly. We actually, Bruno and I, we talked about Captain the other day, just specifically what you were saying. Wouldn't it be great if TestKube could be those, part of those quality gates? And since TestKube isn't, I mean, for now it's functional tests, but hypothetically it could be running any kind of test. So you really have any kind of quality gate that you want, part of your Captain, what do they call them? Not workflows, but well, whatever.
Sequences.
Sequences,
but that if you considered cloud events to be able to talk to it as well, then you can do Argo events. There's so much, cloud events are becoming sort of the standard for talking to each other with tools now. So that could be something to consider for the roadmap as well. Yeah,
that's great. That's a great idea. Mentally noted. Definitely cloud events. Thank you for that. I'd be curious to hear just around executors. I mean, we have Postman and Cypress. Obviously, we had to start somewhere. But what are your thoughts on what kind of executors do you think would be relevant to have in the Kubernetes
I'd like to see a template. So I go into the KubeShop GitHub, and then there's a executor template, and then I can make my own. That would be quite cool.
And I think there is, let me see. TestKube executor template. There you go.
Oh yeah, that's cool. Yeah, and that's written in Go. Yeah,
that's written in Go. Yeah. So, and I think, and it's actually also in. If you go to the documentation. So, let me see. TestKube documentation. There is some creating your custom executor. So there's definitely some documentation here with some code samples and stuff. So we try to make it easy.
I might make one later on.
Oh, that'd be awesome. That'd be awesome.
Yeah, please do.
But for ones that I'd like to see, probably OPA would be a good one. So Open Policy Agent. That would be good to validate and test policies relating to lots of things: Kubernetes, Docker, Terraform. OPA would be a nice, easy, powerful one to add. The great thing is with this architecture, you can do whatever you want, really. Maybe a bit of static code analysis as well.
Yeah, I think it's to your point. I mean, it doesn't have to be. If thinking testing, you think functional testing easily. It's by default, at least I do. But definitely, compliance, OPA. Just there's a lot of tools now just to validate, like do security assessments of your cluster, and that could be super important as well. And I don't know, performance testing is hard, I guess, because you're so dependent on the state of your infrastructure, which you might not. It's hard to rely on in the cloud, I guess. So you don't know what you'll get, but usually maybe performance tests would be more around baseline and establishing that you have a base performance in place, and not a stress test where you see kind of what's the max. So you can.
But all of those things, and helping with guardrails so people don't do things wrong. Organizations won't admit it, but they're not really mature in that space as well. So if you have something like this that's done for you, then that would be a great value to the business, especially with this hot market that we're in. I mean, the testing team is probably going to start costing a lot of money, especially in Australia anyway. And it's hard to find people. So having a tool that I wouldn't say replaces them, but a system would be good.
Yeah, well, definitely. If we can help testers, be better at creating tests, or be more productive, efficient, I think that's I mean, I think that's the best thing we can do, so they can focus also on more exploratory testing and the kind of testing where their testing mindset really comes to help. I've met the testers over the years who people who can crash the media player on the airplane. Like they have this talent for just finding bugs. They're the best people to have on your team. It's awesome. Okay, great. Okay, just a little bit of a demo, I guess. So I did set up. Let's see if this is still running. It is awesome. So I have I've set up the Swagger pet store, which most people seem to know. This is running in a Google Cloud cluster, and in that cluster, I've also installed TestKube, just using the you can see all the components running there. So it's the API server, it's a dashboard, yes, the Minio, MongoDB for the results, etc. And if we just have a look at the dashboard, you can see it. It's running in the cluster. There's a command line command to open up the dashboard. It'll automatically tunnel you into it, so you don't have to create like ingress configurations to expose it. But if you want to expose it with HTTPS, etc., you'd have to configure a more that kind of access to it. But basically, it's pretty basic at this point, right? So here are my tests. Here are the scripts that I have. I can see for each script the executions that have been, and then for each execution, I can kind of here see to the right the results. There's a log output here. These are Postman collections that you can see. From yes.
Can you zoom in just a little bit too, if possible? No.
No, I'm sure I can. I don't know what's the command to do that.
Command plus.
Command plus. Yeah.
Yeah. Is this better?
Yeah, just a little bit. Thanks.
Like that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Great. Yeah. So here. Sorry, thanks for asking. So these are different Postman collections that have been running. You have the outputs here from Newman, so you can see really what's happened. These are Cypress tests. Here's a Cypress test that failed. I can download the video or the screenshot. Let's have a look at that one. Yeah, so this is kind of the final screenshot. There's oh yeah, I'll show you. This was actually a deliberate failure. Going back to what you talked about CRDs, right? So I'm gonna look at, let's have a look. So this is looking into our cluster using our nice other tool, Monocle. So here you can actually see the tests that we were looking at. So this is the CRD, right? The Cypress Pet Store test. So you can see it's basically, it's a CRD. It points to a branch in Git. That's all. It's really, really basic at this point. When it comes to the Postman collections, you'll see that this actually contains the Postman collection. So the content is in here. So when you apply your Postman collections to the cluster, they're actually stored in the CRD. But we're adding this kind of Git support, as you saw for Cypress in the next release. So it's a pretty straightforward. You also see the executors. There's 3 executors here. They're all CRDs, right? So you can point kind of which image to run and which types of test scripts they run. So there's an association. So when the TestKube server has to run a script, it'll look for an executor that matches the type of the script, and then it'll ask it to run it. So you could basically have different executors running the same type of script, and maybe for different purposes. But yeah, just to kind of show you what it looks like in your cluster, I'm not going to walk you through command line commands of creating tests, because that's pretty tedious. I did mention that, so these are scripts. So here's also a curl script, so you can actually see the actual curl command that's going to be run if you run this as a test. And then we said tests, and a test is in a sequence of steps, which is very basic here. So you can see that this will first run this pet store inventory script, and then it'll delay, and then it'll run another script, and then it'll delay, and then it's going to run Cypress test for test. So this will run tests against both front end and back end, right? So to validate that everything's working fine together. And if I want to run these tests today, I basically have to do that from the command line. Let's see if I can find the, let me see, is that Cypress? Yes, if I start this here, the launch get the test started. If I go back to the dashboard, I'll see also here that the test is started now and it's running. And we can, you can see that it's already finished. Those Postman collections are pretty quick. So the first Postman collection is already finished. Now the second Postman collection is finished, which was those steps in the test. And now it's going to run the Cypress test, which takes a little while. So it takes like a minute or two to do all that. And I can also see the individual script executions here. So this is one. These are the two ones that just ran, and I can look at the output and all that kind of stuff. And this is the Cypress test that is currently running. We're not going to see much there until the result is in, which will take a little while. Yeah, so this is basically kind of just a high-level, view of the components you have. You have your scripts, your tests, you have the command line to run tests or to create tests, and then you can see the results here. And you can obviously use any cluster interaction tool. You don't have to use Mongoose. You can use Lens or whatever to work with the resources directly, the CRDs in your cluster if you want to, and do that. I do want to show, lastly, also, I had set up a GitHub Action. So this is the actual Swagger pet store. This is a repo I'd set up. Sorry, I'm just going to go. This is the repo that holds the Cypress tests, and it contains a workflow that'll automatically run these tests every time I push updates to my repo, right? So every time I push updates to the Cypress test main, it's going to trigger the execution of that test that you saw, right? So I can make sure that, obviously, that my tests are always executed after I update them. So obviously, to prove my point, I'm just going to go in and fix this. So the test actually passes. Oops, that.
Oh, pushing directly to main.
Directly to main, I know.
Yeah,
that's what we do in Sweden.
Request.
Scary.
Yeah, I know. Don't tell Dimitri. Let me see. So now I'm gonna have to go back to the dashboard. It'll take a little while for let me see, you can look at the actions here. You can see that the action is started to run the test, and in a sec or two, we're going to see that that test is also going to get started here. It takes a while for, here we go. So you can see that this test is now started. We can also see here this was the test that I ran. You can see that the last step failed here. We can look at, it's right here. So this is the failed test. Hello, I want to see this one. You can look at the video. I'm not going to do that, but you get the point. You'll see the video of the test running in Cypress. And in a little while, we'll hopefully see this test running again, but this time successful because I had fixed the validation in the Cypress test script. So just to kind of show you a little bit how that was a really quick and dirty demo of kind of how these different components come together and how you could set them up and use them. And so, Brad, I guess question back to you and anyone else. Does that make any sense, or how does that? How was that? Any questions about that?
Yeah, no, it's good. I think it's really interesting. Yeah, I can't wait to try it out, actually.
Okay, well, I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, no, I think it's good. I really like the UI UX as well. Even on the KubeShop website, it's really pleasing to be on.
Okay,
so I think
thank you.
You're doing a really good job there.
Thank you. I'll forward that to the people who've been working.
I agree.
Because it has been. How many folks do you have working at KubeShop?
We're about 20 something now. I think it's
okay.
15 something engineers. They're mostly in Europe or in the European time zone, I guess. And then we have Kelly and some back office, web design, etc. in the US. Okay,
so you're pretty much full remote.
Yes, we're full remote.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Okay.
Yeah, and we're hiring. Take the opportunity. And we're all open source, so if you want to work on cool open source projects targeting Kubernetes, you should get in touch.
Yeah. And what sort of roles are you hiring at the moment?
Well, we need smart engineers that have experience with Kubernetes, that want to build compelling tools for end users. Preferably have experience with working with open source tools that know how that's like, kind of the motion around open source. You always want to make people happy, obviously, but I think open source is a special kind of happiness that you're looking for. And it's both front end, of course, but it's also back end Kubernetes. So smart people are always welcome.
And do you have any good first issues that people can come and they want to kick the tires, they want to see if they want to start doing some contributions?
There's definitely a lot of issues in GitHub. I don't know if we have. Can't comment on the TestKube repo. I know that on the Monocle repo, there's a bunch of issues that are flagged with good first issue. So that's definitely, we can filter. See. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yeah.
But we have a Discord server, right? So if you're interested in, like you're saying, you'd want to help with creating an executor, or you just want to interested, go there and ask. We're super happy and to be in touch and hear kind of how we can improve and what might be a good idea to do next. I think the challenge for us still is getting feedback, right? And really understanding. We're putting a stake in the ground with what the slides that I showed you around TestKube, but ultimately we're going to have to figure out what's the best fit for our users, and the only way to find out is to talk to them. And I know Bruno's doing a great job of reaching out to people, but anyone that's willing to talk to us and share their experiences and gripes with testing in Kubernetes or TestKube or anything else, we're all ears.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, all right. Well,
yeah, and
thank you so much.
Sure, just I can wrap up. And how to get started, there's a bunch on GitHub and instructions. It's pretty straightforward. And as I said, get in touch on Discord or GitHub. And a little bit about the roadmap. I think you mentioned some really interesting stuff, and we've talked around many of these things already around supporting more frameworks, data-driven testing, maybe more native integrations for different types CI/CD frameworks, or Flux and Argo and things like that, to make it really easy to integrate. And then have the dashboard now, as I said, is read only, and we know that testers are not, if we can provide tools that help testers be more productive, where they can use a UI to maybe define tests or orchestrate tests, that's something we'd love to do. There's always a challenge. How do you tie that into a GitOps model? But it's something I'm sure we can work out. Yeah, sorry. That's it.
Yeah.
Okay,
so there's the Discord
don't forget,
channel as
guys,
well.
we have a quick survey. So if you guys want to contribute about and you do tests, and so we have 5 questions there, just to ask, like, basically, what do you do when it comes to testing? Feel free to reach out there.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. That was a really good overview. I've learned a lot.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having us. And anyone watching, and please reach out, talk to us. And it's great talking to you, Brad, as always.
Yeah, always. Yeah. All right.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for waking up early, staying up late. See y'all.
See ya.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.